The temp nurse empties bedpans at 0300 hours with the kind of precision that doesn't belong in a graveyard shift. Her hands move like instruments calibrated for something far more critical than waste disposal. She doesn't hum. Doesn't chat with the skeleton crew. Doesn't linger where she isn't needed. Rachel Torres is the kind of invisible that comes from practice, the kind that happens when you've learned to move through dangerous places without drawing attention. Seattle General's night shift doesn't ask questions about the woman who shows up, does her 12 hours, and leaves without a signature on anyone's memory. She's a temp. There are always temps. Her badge reads Torres, R in deliberately small print. The graveyard wing of Jacksonville's largest teaching hospital runs on people like her, competent ghosts who prop up the skeleton crew when acuity spikes and nobody else wants the midnight rotation. The antiseptic smell doesn't register anymore. Neither does the cold hum of the fluorescent lights, or the sound of the pneumatic for pump cycling in room 407. Rachel changes a dressing on a post-op patient in Trauma Bay 2, her movements precise enough that the surgeon would approve, efficient enough that the resident wouldn't think twice about her credentials. When she reaches for fresh gauze, the edge of a scar peeks from beneath her scrub sleeve, textured, old, the kind that tells a story to people who know how to read scars. Most don't. Her locker on the 3rd floor contains 3 things: a cracked travel mug that says "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters, a jacket with a faded insignia sewn into the lining so carefully that you'd only see it if you knew to look, and a photo she doesn't take out anymore. The unit patch, a Marjah's emblem, barely visible in the fluorescent glow of the break room, sits stitched inside her jacket like a secret. She folded that insignia into the lining 17 years ago, back when she still believed in things like rank and recognition and the idea that doing the right thing meant something to the people who give orders. That belief didn't survive Marjah. The dying succulent on the nurse's station is hers too, though no one knows it. She waters it at 0200 hours when the floor is quietest and her shift has 6 hours left to burn. The plant was green once. Vibrant. Someone threw it away 3 months ago, and Rachel pulled it from the trash and brought it to the station because she understands the feeling of being discarded and still trying to live anyway. Dr. Caldwell noticed her precisely once during orientation. He looked up from his tablet, eyes moving across her like a spotlight across empty highway, and said, "Try to keep up with the real staff." Then he looked back at the monitor, dismissing her entirely. She'd nodded, "Yes, doctor," and that was fine. Being underestimated is a luxury she'd learned to appreciate. It means nobody watches too carefully. Nobody asks questions. Nobody sees the way she holds a chart with the authority of someone who's read 500 of them in crisis conditions. Nobody notices the slight limp favoring her left leg, the result of shrapnel from a mortar round that hit the field hospital in San Juan Valley in 2009, a wound she rehabilitated in a military hospital where the doctors knew her rank and her name and the exact number of lives her field medicine had saved. That was before the court-martial. Before the presiding officer who'd signed the papers that erased her career. Before she became a ghost. The night shift at Seattle General is quiet tonight. The kind of quiet that comes at 02 for 5 hours when the worst of the trauma admissions has passed and the stable patients sleep and the night crew breathes for a moment. Rachel finishes a set of vitals on the post-op floor and heads to the ICU for her 0300 rounds. The ventilators wheeze their mechanical rhythm. The monitors beep in syncopation, a sound she knows better than her own heartbeat. Then the emergency entrance erupts. Sirens outside. The overhead page crackling to life. A voice, trauma alert. ETA 3 minutes. Vehicle accident. Driver unconscious. GCS 6 on scene. The floor mobilizes. Doors slam. The code team assembles with the practiced choreography of people who've done this hundreds of times. Rachel moves toward the trauma bay automatically, her body following the current of crisis the way it's been trained to. Grab the supplies. Clear the bed. Anticipate what comes next. The ambulance roars up outside. The automatic doors gasp open. Boots thunder across tile, paramedics shouting vitals, nurses receiving, the kind of controlled chaos that looks like anarchy to people who don't understand the language. The stretcher comes through at velocity. Navy Captain James Hendrick arrives unconscious on a gurney, his unconscious body strapped down with restraints, his left arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage that tells the story of a vehicle that disagreed with him at high speed. The paramedic is calling the report, 48-year-old male, unrestrained driver, single vehicle collision at 2,300 hours, driver ejected from the vehicle, GCS 6 on scene, responsive to pain only, no spontaneous movement. Rachel freezes. Her hand hovers over the incoming chart, halfway extended. Her breathing changes. Not dramatically. Not visibly to anyone who isn't trained to see the precise moment when a human being recognizes her own ending walking through the door on a stretcher. She knows that face. She knows the clean military haircut and the weathered jaw and the specific arrangement of features that have lived in her memory for the 15 years she spent trying to forget him. Captain James Hendrick. The presiding officer of her court-martial. The man whose signature appeared on the dishonorable discharge papers that burned her career into ash. The officer who'd looked at her testimony, at the written account of the field hospital she'd run alone for 6 hours during the evacuation of Marjah, at the lives she'd saved when the only alternative was leaving them to die, and decided that what she'd done crossed some line that mattered more than the consequence of inaction. His body is beaten. His face is swollen with the early blooming of hematomas. One eye is sealed shut. But the other eye remains that particular shade of military blue that she remembers from the courtroom in 2009, when he'd read the charges against her while she stood at attention and felt the floor of her world crack open. The trauma bay swallows him whole. The code team moves around the stretcher with predatory efficiency, calling for lines and imaging and the sound of organized violence disguised as medicine. Rachel's hand drops. She takes one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from muscle memory, from 17 years of learning to process impossible things in silence. Dr. Caldwell rounds the corner at 0310 hours, tablet in hand, stopping at the observation window of the trauma bay. He watches the code team work on the unconscious captain with the detached interest of a surgeon who's seen 10,000 bodies in 10,000 states of emergency. Broken ones are just data. Until something makes them interesting. Then he sees her. Rachel stands at the doorway to the trauma bay, frozen in that particular posture of someone who's just had the past walk through the door on a stretcher. Her jaw is clenched so precisely that Caldwell can see it from 20 feet away. Her hands are curled into fists, not the kind of fists that suggest anger, but the kind that suggest the exercise of extraordinary restraint. Caldwell's eyes narrow. He watches Rachel for 7 seconds. Watches the slight tremor in her shoulders that she's trying not to show. Watches the way she stares at the unconscious face of Captain Hendrick as if he's the most important problem in the world and simultaneously the worst thing that could possibly happen. Then his gaze travels down to the chart in her hands, the one she's supposed to be filing, the one she hasn't filed because she's too busy recognizing a man she probably didn't expect to see ever again. Caldwell smiles. It's not a warm smile. It's the kind of smile that appears on a predator's face when it identifies prey that doesn't know it's being hunted. He watches for another moment, then turns away and walks down the corridor, already thinking 3 moves ahead, already calculating angles and leverage and the precise number of ways he can use this frozen moment of recognition against the temp nurse who suddenly, in the span of a heartbeat, became infinitely more interesting. The night shift continues. The trauma team stabilizes Captain Hendrick and moves him to ICU bed 7. The unconscious officer is hooked to machines that breathe for him and feed his veins with medications and monitor every failing system his broken body contains. Nurses call out numbers, BP 90/62. Heart rate 118. O2 sat 94 on high flow. The vocabulary of damage and recovery. Rachel finishes her rounds at 0430 hours. She doesn't approach ICU bed 7. She doesn't acknowledge Captain Hendrick's existence. She moves through the remaining patients with the kind of professional distance that suggests she's never seen his face in her life, never stood in a military courtroom while he signed away her career, never spent 15 years rebuilding herself from the rubble of what he decided she deserved. She waters the succulent at 02 for 5 hours the next night, before her shift begins. The dying plant is still dying. Still trying. Still here. The night shift carries her forward through the darkness, and somewhere in ICU bed 7, the man who ended her world breathes through a ventilator while the woman he destroyed empties bedpans and changes dressings and pretends to be the kind of invisible that doesn't see him at all. But Dr. Caldwell sees everything. Rachel sat in the break room at 2,213 hours with Captain Hendrick's chart spread across her lap, pen moving across her personal notepad. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired frequency above her. The medication orders didn't align, not with his weight, not with his condition, not with anything that made medical sense. The anticoagulant dosage was compressed into dangerous intervals. Subcutaneous injections scheduled 8 hours apart instead of 12. The numbers didn't lie. They screamed. She circled 3 entries. 8 milligrams when 4 should have been the maximum. The handwriting belonged to 3 different physicians, yet the dosing pattern repeated with mechanical precision. Not variation. Coordination. She had seen pharmaceutical protocols change before, never across multiple prescribers simultaneously unless someone orchestrated it. The break room door opened. Dr. Caldwell filled the threshold like a weather system, his coat unbuttoned, his expression carrying that predatory ease of someone who had never once questioned his own authority. He didn't ask permission to lean against the counter. His eyes moved from her face to the chart in her hands. Something confusing you, Rachel the temp. She looked up slowly. Her hands remained still. Her voice came out steady as a metronome. These medication orders for Captain Hendrick. The anticoagulant dosage is inconsistent with his weight and his current presentation. He smiled. That smile was a blade wrapped in velvet. This is why temps don't question attending physicians, Rachel. We went to medical school. We spent years in residency. You went to, where did you go again? A community college program? A for-profit nursing diploma mill? He pushed off from the counter with his shoulder, moving closer. The dosage could cause internal bleeding. You should mention that to someone who cares what you think. She took one measured breath. Let it settle into her chest where it belonged. The dosage could cause internal bleeding. Stick to bedpans. He left the break room. The door swung shut with a pneumatic hiss. Rachel sat very still, studying the chart again. She had learned long ago that anger was useful only when it served a purpose. Right now it needed to serve precision. 2 hours later, the overhead speaker crackled to life. Static first, then a voice pitched with the kind of condescension reserved for people everyone had already decided were temporary. Rachel the temp to administration. Rachel the temp to administration. The break room fell silent. A resident smirked into his coffee. A veteran nurse, someone who had been on this unit long enough to recognize the pattern, looked away with the careful politeness of people who had learned not to watch. Rachel set down her pen, folded the chart, and stood. The long corridor stretched ahead of her in fluorescent monotony. Whispers followed like smoke. She passed the medication station, the supply room, the nurse's station where 3 people suddenly became very interested in their computers. When she reached the administrative wing, Dr. Caldwell was waiting in the hallway outside the office door. His hand shot out and caught her by the elbow, steering her into the supply closet without a word. The door closed. The overhead lights died to a single fixture casting harsh shadows across shelves of bandaging supplies and sterile instruments. His voice dropped. Not louder. Lower. The kind of low that meant he was no longer pretending to be professional. You've been here 3 weeks, Rachel. 3 weeks. You don't understand our protocols. You don't understand hospital politics. You don't understand how things work when you're not a favor and not a hire and not a person anyone respects. If you keep questioning physicians who have been practicing medicine since before you learn to take a blood pressure, you will not have a job by Friday. Do we understand each other? She met his eyes. Didn't blink. Didn't flinch. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something else entirely, the kind of control that came from having already lost everything once before and discovering you could survive it. A single tear escaped her left eye. She wiped it with her index finger without breaking eye contact. Without apologizing. Without the small flinch that would have given him the satisfaction he was fishing for. Captain Hendrick deserves better than what you're giving him. His jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that. He had expected capitulation, tears, maybe a quiet apology. What he got was a woman made of reinforced steel looking him in the face and stating a fact. The supply closet suddenly felt too small for both of them. He opened the door. You're moved to custodial. Effective immediately. Pending review. The parking lot sprawled under sodium lights like a stage. The night shift was arriving for handoff, 40 nurses moving between cars, pulling on scrub jackets, mentally transitioning from whatever lives they lived outside these walls to the ones they inhabited inside them. Caldwell stood under the lights with a mop and bucket waiting at his feet. His voice carried the kind of projection that ensured everyone heard. Torres. You're being moved to custodial pending performance review. Maybe that's more your speed. He handed her the mop. The handle was still damp from the evening shift. The bucket water smelled like bleach and something else, something that reminded Rachel of the morning she scrubbed down a barracks in Marjah, 2011, after the IED took out half of 2nd Platoon. The arriving nurses watched. They weren't cruel. They were just observers. In hospitals, as in war, silence was survival. Rachel took the mop with steady hands. The wood was rough against her palms. She didn't thank him. She didn't protest. She simply turned and walked toward the custodial closet on the east wing while conversation resumed behind her, people talking around the thing they had just witnessed like it was a chair in the middle of the room. She had 10 minutes before the night shift fully staffed. 10 minutes to understand what she was actually looking at. The pattern had been surgical from the beginning. She had been too distracted by Captain Hendrick's presence to see it clearly until now. But now she could see it. Dr. Caldwell had been rotating staff for the past 6 weeks. Every experienced nurse who had worked this unit in the previous rotation, the ones who would recognize medication inconsistencies, who would question the prescribing patterns, who had survived long enough in this profession to trust their instincts, had been reassigned. Different departments. Different shifts. Different floors. The scheduling was not random. The scheduling was architecture. What they didn't know was that Rachel Torres had spent 8 years managing logistics for combat operations across 3 provinces, tracking resources, identifying inefficiencies, recognizing the fingerprints of coordination versus coincidence. She could read a supply manifest the way other people read faces. She positioned herself outside Hendrick's room at 2,227 hours with her mop, watching through the small window in the door. A nurse she didn't recognize, someone new, someone whose credentials probably stopped short of catching deliberate pharmaceutical manipulation, administered medication from a syringe. The movement was practiced. Routine. The kind of procedure that didn't invite questions because nothing about it seemed unusual unless you knew what to look for. And Rachel knew what to look for. The staffing board in the break room listed 16 nurses for the night shift. 16. The standard was 24. The veteran staff, the ones who could spot inconsistencies, the ones with institutional memory, were gone. In their place were newer hires, agency temps, residents still learning the difference between procedure and protocol. During her custodial rounds, she emptied the trash in Hendrick's room. She had exactly 3 seconds to glance at his updated chart. New medication orders. Same dangerous dosages. Now signed by 3 different attending physicians. The coordination had progressed. No single doctor could be blamed. No single decision could be traced back. The liability was distributed like a weight spread across load-bearing walls so no single structure bore the burden of collapse. She photographed the orders with her phone. The flash was covered. Her hands didn't shake. In the break room at 2,344 hours, she called the nursing agency that had placed her. The coordinator answered on the second ring. Rachel identified herself. The coordinator cut her off before she finished her name. Ms. Torres, We've received concerns from Seattle General regarding your performance. We're reviewing your placement. The line went dead. Caldwell had been making calls. He had been moving pieces. He had been orchestrating this with the same precision he used to coordinate medication dosages across multiple physicians. Remove the threat. Isolate the variable. Ensure that when something went wrong, the path backward led nowhere. At midnight, Rachel was mopping outside the conference room when voices carried through the door. Caldwell's voice first, calm as still water. The pharmaceutical supplier delivers tomorrow. Make sure the inventory matches the billing, not the actual product. A younger doctor. Someone Rachel didn't recognize. And if someone notices? Caldwell laughed. The sound was confident. Practiced. Who's going to notice? I've cleaned house. The veteran staff is gone. The temp is gone. The only people left are residents and agency nurses worried about their next placement. Nobody questions me. Nobody ever questions me. Rachel kept mopping. The movements were methodical. Meditative. Her hands gripped the handle tighter, tight enough that the wood creaked faintly under the pressure. She pulled the photograph from her wallet, 8 faces in desert camouflage from a phi base in Marjah, 2011. 18 months into her first tour. The unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining was visible at the edge of the frame, the gold stitching catching light. 3 faces were circled in pen. Kia. Died in action. Names and dates on the back in handwriting she recognized as her own, written the same week she had learned what it meant to be responsible for people who didn't come home. One measured breath. Dr. James Caldwell had no idea what he was standing next to. He heard a supply closet door opening. He heard a mop handle move across tile. He heard the sound of someone doing custodial work, temporary work, work he had decided was beneath questioning. He heard anything except the truth. The truth was standing 3 meters away, wearing scrubs, holding a mop, and now understanding exactly what she was fighting against. The mop handle was worn smooth. Rachel's hands knew the weight of it like they knew the weight of a rifle, like they knew the weight of every mistake that had landed her here, pushing dirty water across linoleum at 2 in the morning while the man she'd saved lay unconscious 3 doors down. The bucket's wheel squeaked on the tile, a sound that made her jaw clench the first time, then nothing. Muscle memory for humiliation. Muscle memory for surviving. She worked the evening corridor on the 4th floor of Seattle General, the night shift that belonged to her now. Temporary assignment. That's what the paperwork said. The hospital's way of saying expendable. The way Caldwell's message had been clear, a mop, a bucket, a timeline measured in days before the nursing agency would receive his final call. Room 304 was 20 meters from the supply closet where he'd cornered her. She'd mapped it. The distance from her current utility station to Hendrick's bedside, along the wall where shadows pooled thickest, past the nurse's station where the graveyard shift sat in exhausted silence. The captain's door remained open, protocol for unconscious ICU patients. She could see his chart clipped to the outside holder. She could see the rhythm of his machines through the doorway, the soft green trace of his heart on the monitor, the oxygen saturation reading glowing in the dark. She didn't stop. She didn't pause. She moved along the corridor like any other midnight custodian, like her eyes weren't cataloging every detail about his condition, like her hands weren't remembering how to read monitors through a doorway. The pattern had become visible on the 3rd night. Rachel noticed everything. It was a skill that hadn't been trained out of her, despite 17 years of trying to disappear. The veteran nurses had vanished from the evening rotation first. Margaret, who'd worked this ward for 8 years. Danny, who'd been here a decade. Thomas, who'd mentioned over coffee 2 weeks ago that he'd never seen hospital politics move this fast. Suddenly they were all scheduled for days. New faces took their places. Younger nurses who didn't know Caldwell yet, who hadn't learned to recognize his footsteps as a warning signal. They moved through the ward with the careful politeness of people trying not to be noticed, and Rachel understood that too. She'd been exactly like them once, invisible by choice, safe through erasure. The attending physician's schedule was posted on the break room wall behind the burnt-out coffee maker nobody had bothered to replace. 20 names listed for tonight's coverage. Rachel had memorized it during her first break. Dr. Caldwell had rewritten it during the 3 weeks she'd worked here, stacking shifts with careful precision. On nights when she was scheduled to clean, every senior attending was assigned. On nights when she wasn't here, the schedule looked different. Lighter. Calmer. Like no one important was needed. She'd seen it happen in military command, the way a leader moved pieces across a board to isolate a target, to cut off reinforcement, to ensure a failure happened in exactly the right moment. Caldwell had learned from something. Or someone had taught him. The competence of it was almost respectable, which made it worse. Her phone buzzed at 2,141 hours. Marcus. Her 17-year-old didn't text often anymore. He'd learned young that mothers who worked hospital nights didn't answer right away. But he'd written, "Mom, you okay? You didn't text." She stood in the supply closet holding the phone, staring at the message. The fluorescent strips overhead cast everything in shades of institutional white. Her thumbs hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to tell him the truth. She wanted to tell him that she was standing in a hospital basement counting down the hours until a man she despised destroyed the career of a woman he'd already destroyed once. She wanted to tell him that sometimes heroism looked like pushing a mop and knowing exactly why, and that there was a kind of dignity in that knowledge that nothing, not court-martials, not demotions, not public humiliation in parking lots, could take from her. Instead she typed, "Working late. Love you." She read it. She deleted it. She wrote, "I'm fine." That was the truth. The clean kind. At 2,247 hours, the monitor alarm in room 304 changed pitch. Not the steady beep that meant the patient was alive and stable. A different frequency. Escalating. The overnight resident, a young man named Chen, maybe 28, came rushing out of the room with his pager already in his hand. "I need help. Patient in 300 and for crashing." His voice carried the edge of panic that came from understanding you were alone. The nurse's station had 3 people at it. They didn't move. They didn't look up. One of them, a woman named Sarah who'd started last week, glanced sideways at the others. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator hum from 3 doors down, the rhythmic wheeze of forced breath. Chen paged the first attending. No answer. He paged the second. The monitor's alarm pitch climbed. Rachel was in the corner replacing the trash in room 301, her movements deliberate and slow, but her attention absolute. She'd learned long ago how to be present while appearing invisible. The calls kept coming. Chen moved with increasing urgency. 3rd page. 4th page. By the 6th, his hands were shaking. Rachel could see it from 30 feet away. She could see the calculation happening in the young resident's mind, the moment when he started understanding that the system wasn't working, that the backup he'd been trained to expect wasn't coming. That something was wrong with the machinery itself. The 20 attending physicians listed on that schedule. Every single one refusing or absent. She'd watched Caldwell work this with surgeon's precision. He hadn't gathered them in a room. He hadn't explicitly told them to ignore the pages. He'd done something more elegant. He'd told them that she was the problem. That the compromised temp had been flagged for performance concerns. That the nursing agency was investigating. That any physician who responded to her assessment would be tangling themselves in an HR nightmare they didn't need. He'd made helping into a liability. At 0115 hours, Rachel was in the utility room refilling the mop bucket when her phone buzzed again. Not Marcus this time. An unknown number. A man's voice came through before she could answer, Dr. Caldwell's assistant in the staffing office, calling the nursing agency. She'd heard him on the phone with this same person twice already this week. His tone was professional. Concerned. "Yes, I know she's been flagged for the supply closet incident. But we're also tracking some additional concerns with her clinical judgment. Just confirming, you are aware of the pattern, correct? The questioning of physician orders. The patient advocacy that's creating friction with attending staff. We want to make sure this is documented properly for the record. The voice on the other end said something Rachel couldn't hear. The assistant continued, "No, we're not asking you to take action. We're just ensuring the file is complete for the termination review." The call ended. Rachel stood very still. The bucket was full now. Water lapped gently against the sides, a sound like breathing. She understood now that Caldwell wasn't trying to push her into making a mistake. He was building the case that she was already the mistake. That her presence was the contamination. The competence of it was chilling. He would cover every angle, close every door, until her only option was to either break protocol herself or accept erasure. The monitor alarm escalated again at 0237 hours. Different pattern. More urgent. Chen's voice carried down the hallway, attending physician to room 304, now. Rachel stood at the nurse's station with the mop, watching. The 20th doctor's page went unanswered. 20 attending physicians on the schedule. She'd counted them. She'd known Caldwell was capable, but understanding his competence and watching it execute in real time were different things. She thought about the letter. The one Hendrick had written 15 years ago, signed with his rank and his position as presiding officer. She'd never seen it, but she'd learned through channels that shouldn't have existed, through whispers from a former JAG officer who'd felt bad, that it existed. A recommendation to overturn the court-martial. A letter that somehow never made it through the chain of command. A voice that had been silenced by the same machinery that was now silencing the calls for help coming from room 304. The machinery that had a human name and wore a white coat and was very, very good at making sure certain people never got heard. Rachel set down the mop. The handle rested against the wall with a soft thud. She'd been trained by the best military medicine had to offer, in the worst conditions the world could manufacture. She'd held people together with her hands. She'd read vitals like poetry and understood what bodies were trying to say when voices couldn't. For 18 months she'd worked here and been nothing, and for 3 weeks she'd been nothing while watching everything. The shame wasn't hers. It never had been. It belonged to men who moved pieces across boards, to systems that protected themselves instead of patients, to the specific kind of cowardice that wore authority like a shield. The monitor in room 304 hit critical threshold. She walked into that room. Her hands remembered. Everything else could be taken, but her hands belonged to something bigger than Caldwell's board game. At 01 for 5 hours, the monitor started screaming. Hendrick's oxygen saturation dropped like a stone, 88, 82, 76. His heart rate climbed to 142, then 156. The overnight resident, Dr. Chen, a third year who'd never handled a true emergency, punched the page button for attending physicians. His fingers shook as he reached for the call system. 20 names on the coordinated schedule. 20 doctors. Caldwell had made the calls systematically across the evening, subtle suggestions, administrative requests, strategic reassignments that ensured the right people were in the wrong places when this moment arrived. 14 pages went unanswered. 6 doctors responded but hung up when they heard Rachel's name attached to the assessment. "I'm not involving myself in whatever she's doing," one senior cardiologist said flatly, cutting the line. 20 attending physicians, and not one would respond. Rachel heard the monitor from 2 floors down, mopping the basement corridor. The sound traveled through the hospital's ventilation system like a ghost, that particular frequency of distress she'd learned to recognize in the screaming heat of Marjah, back when she held lives together with her hands while rounds of small arms fire punched through canvas. She set down the mop without thinking. Muscle memory. Her feet were moving before her brain caught up. She was at Hendrick's bedside in 43 seconds. His lips were blue. Not the pale of poor perfusion, the deep cyanotic blue of oxygen starvation. His chest moved wrong. The left side rising and falling with breath. The right side? Collapsed. Completely still. Tension pneumothorax. The air had leaked from his lung into the space around it, compressing everything, collapsing his right lung entirely, pushing his heart toward his left side like something drowning. "Get me a 14-gauge needle." "Now," Rachel said. Dr. Chen stared at her. The resident saw the cardboard box waiting in her locker downstairs. Saw the mop handle leaning against the wall. Saw a custodian in a grey hospital uniform with water-stained scrubs underneath and said, "I'm not authorized." "Move." The word carried 15 years of command. Field hospitals. Combat zones. The specific tone of someone who'd watched people die from hesitation. Dr. Chen moved. Rachel ripped open Hendrick's hospital gown. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser as she palpated the landmarks, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out something impossible, an MRE packet. Meals ready to eat. She'd carried 3 of them in her bag since her discharge. Old habits. The muscle memory of places where supplies didn't arrive, where you worked with what you had, where improvisation meant the difference between a patient living and dying on the floor of a tent with mortar rounds walking across the roof like footsteps. She tore the packaging open. The plastic crinkled like a gunshot in the sudden silence. The packet contained a salt tablet and a cinnamon roll, useless. Except for the waterproof outer wrapper. She ripped it free, folded it once, created a 3-sided seal. "Betadine," Rachel said. Dr. Chen held up the bottle with both hands, understanding at last what was happening. Rachel swabbed the skin. One smooth motion. The antiseptic smell, sharp, medicinal, the smell of places where infection meant amputation, filled the space above Hendrick's chest. "Hold this," Rachel said, pressing the makeshift seal against the site. "If air hisses out, you cover it with your finger. Immediately. Understand?" Chen nodded. She positioned the needle. 16 gauge would have been better, but 14 was what they had. She could feel the landmarks under her fingers, the space between the ribs, the angle of approach. The same angle she'd calculated 1,000 times in the dark, with explosions walking closer. On 3. 1. 2. She inserted the needle on 2. Better to keep people off balance. The needle passed through skin, through the intercostal muscle, through the pleural membrane. There was resistance, then a sudden release. The hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound she'd heard in 15 years. The monitors responded immediately. Oxygen saturation climbed, 76, 81, 86, 92. Hendrick's color shifted from cyanotic blue toward pink. His heart rate began to descend, 140, 128, 115. "Chest tube tray," Rachel said to Chen, her voice already shifting into the next set of orders. "We need to stabilize this, get him properly decompressed before." The door burst open. Dr. Caldwell. 2 security guards flanking him like armor. His face had that particular shade of rage that comes from losing control of a carefully constructed narrative. "Stop!" His voice made the room's air pressure change. Rachel didn't stop. She was directing Chen through the next steps, securing the needle, checking bilateral breath sounds, preparing for the tube. Caldwell crossed the room in 4 strides and physically pulled her away from the bedside, his hand closing around her upper arm with the grip of someone accustomed to power, accustomed to obedience. "Step away from that patient immediately," Caldwell said, his words directed at Rachel but his eyes on the medical team now responding to her orders. "This woman is not authorized." Rachel was already standing. She took one measured breath. Didn't tense, didn't resist, didn't reach for him. She simply stood there with his hand around her arm, watching the monitors. "Security, remove her from this hospital," Caldwell said. "Now." The 2 guards each took an arm. Rachel still wasn't tensing. Still wasn't fighting. She was watching the oxygen saturation, 94% and stable. Watching the heart rate normalize, 108, perfectly acceptable. Watching Dr. Chen continuing the protocol she'd started, the medical team moving with the confidence that comes from clear orders and clear direction. Caldwell was already on his phone as they guided her toward the elevator. "Yes, I'm calling to terminate her agency contract immediately. Document it. Unauthorized medical procedure. Violation of scope of practice. I want her removed from every hospital in this state's network if possible." The elevator doors closed on the sight of Hendrick's monitors showing the kind of readings that meant alive. That meant saved. By 0600 hours, Rachel sat at a bus stop on Atlantic Boulevard, rain hammering the shelter like applause. A cardboard box sat on her lap. Inside was everything she owned from Seattle General, a cracked ceramic mug with a lighthouse painted on it. A dying succulent with brown leaves and one green shoot struggling upward. A photograph of her unit in Marjah, 8 faces in desert camouflage, squinting into sun that could burn skin. 3 of those faces were gone now. This side of the ground. The rain soaked through her jacket. She felt the faded unit patch sewn into the lining, the Navy insignia barely visible through the degraded fabric, the thread work she'd done herself at 2,300 hours in a forward operating base, stitching the colors of where she came from into cloth where no one would see it. The patch was waterlogged now, heavy with rain and 15 years of carried weight. She stared at the photo. Looked at the eyes of men she'd trained with, bled with, buried. Looked at her own younger face, sharper then, harder then, still believing the world made sense. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus, Mom, where are you?" She didn't answer. She just sat there as the rain soaked the cardboard, as the letters on the mug began to smudge, as the unit patch grew heavier with every drop. The bus was late. Everything was late. Everything was always late. But at Seattle General, at 0601 hours exactly, Dr. Caldwell sat at his desk and pulled up the security footage he'd tried to delete 12 hours earlier. The footage that the hospital's IT director, a former Marine who'd recognized Rachel Torres from a unit photo that had hung in a corner of the break room for 3 months, had preserved across 17 different backup servers. He pulled up the footage of himself entering the pharmaceutical supply room. The footage of him switching the labels on 3 different bottles. The footage of him entering Captain Hendrick's medication orders into the system, creating the precise combination of errors that would have killed a patient over the course of a week. He closed the footage. Started making calls. Started lawyering up. But the rain kept falling on the bus stop where Rachel Torres sat holding the last physical evidence of who she actually was, and somewhere in the hospital, Captain James Hendrick's oxygen saturation remained at 96%, his heart rate steady at 104, his breathing supported by the emergency protocol of a woman they decided to fire for saving his life. That afternoon, the apartment was silent except for the rain hammering against the windows, the kind of rain that sounds like applause, or accusations, depending on how you listen. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, cardboard box on her lap, staring at the photograph of her unit in Marjah. 8 faces. 3 of them gone now. The faded unit patch visible where the photo bent was the only thing she'd kept from 15 years ago that wasn't a scar or a memory. Her 17-year-old son Marcus found her there without knocking. He never knocked anymore. He just appeared in doorways the way soldiers do, silent and sudden, having learned to read rooms before entering them. Mom. 1 word. The way he said it meant everything was about to change. He pulled a wooden case from his backpack. Not large. The kind of box that holds the weight of a lifetime anyway. Walnut veneer, brass hinges, the kind of thing you don't buy, you inherit it or you keep it sealed in your heart for years before anyone knows it exists. His hands were steady as he opened it, the way her hands had been steady at Captain Hendrick's bedside when 20 doctors decided to abandon him. Inside, the Navy Cross caught the grey afternoon light. 2 purple hearts. The bronze star with V device for Valor. Each one gleaming like an accusation or a promise, depending on which one you looked at first. They fired you for saving someone's life, Marcus said. His voice had his father's precision but her composure. They need to see these. She didn't reach for them. She couldn't. The moment her hands touched that case was the moment the nurse became the soldier again, and she wasn't sure yet if that was a resurrection or a relapse. The hospital board emergency meeting was called for 0700 hours the next morning. Caldwell had scheduled it himself, probably confident that termination was a formality, another bureaucratic box to check before he moved on to his next temp nurse, his next victim, his next $200,000 in kickback money. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and air conditioning that had been running since before dawn. 18 board members. Caldwell in a charcoal suit. The hospital administrator with his hands folded like a prayer. The chief nursing officer with tears already forming because she knew what was coming and couldn't stop it. Then the door opened. Marcus walked in like he'd been summoned by the Pentagon itself. 17 years old, wearing the dress blues she'd never shown him, wearing her decoration with the kind of casual respect that comes from understanding what blood costs. He opened the wooden case on the conference table and set it down in the center like evidence at a trial. Because it was. The board chair picked up the Navy Cross first, rotating it in his fingers. His eyes widened. Not because he recognized the medal, anyone could look up what a Navy Cross meant, but because something in the room had shifted. The air pressure had changed. The light had changed. A 17-year-old kid in dress uniform had just told everyone that the woman they'd fired 12 hours ago was the person you don't fire, the person you don't challenge, the person who held a field hospital together alone while people bled and died around her. Marjah, the chair said. His voice was reading from the wooden nameplate engraved on the case. Rachel Torres. A trembling nurse pulled up the service record on the projector screen. Her hand shook so badly the mouse cursor kept jumping. She read aloud, voice breaking between each word, Naval Station Norfolk. Rank, Major. Unit assignment, Naval Medical Corps, Special Operations Command. 18 years active duty. She looked up from the screen, tears streaming down her face. She was Socum. The door opened again. Commander Hawkins walked in wearing the kind of presence that made the air pressure change again. He'd served under Rachel's command in Marjah. 10 tours between them. 2 men who died in the field hospital she ran. He approached the wooden case and identified each decoration with the precision of someone who'd earned 6 of his own. His voice carried the weight of combat. Navy Cross for actions under fire during the evacuation of FOB Shank. She was the medical officer. 314-meter distance. Incoming fire from multiple positions. She didn't evacuate. She stayed. He picked up one Purple Heart. His hand trembled. Not weakness, restraint. The kind of restraint that comes from having already survived the worst. Wounded during treatment of casualties. Enemy contact, Helmand Province, San Jin Valley. Continued medical operations despite GSW to the left shoulder. The second Purple Heart. Second wound. 3 weeks later. Same location. She was the only physician within 40 kilometers. She stayed until the field hospital could be evacuated, then went back the next day. He picked up the Bronze Star with V device. The V meant Valor. The Bronze Star meant sacrifice. Together, they meant she'd done something under fire that most people couldn't do standing still in a quiet room. She held the field hospital alone for 6 hours during the Marjah evacuation. 6 hours. No backup. No extraction until every casualty was stabilized or died trying. 247 lives. That's the count from her after-action report. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming above your head. One of the board members was staring at her chair, the one she'd been sitting in before she was fired. The administrator's face had gone the color of old concrete. Then the door opened a third time. FBI Special Agent Morris walked in with a briefcase that looked like it weighed as much as the truth. He spread documents across the conference table like evidence at a trial because that's exactly what they were. Purchase orders. Inventory reports. Emails with timestamps. His voice was precise, clinical, damning. Dr. Caldwell has been receiving kickbacks from Medisupply Solutions for 36 months. The hospital paid for premium medications. Substandard generics were delivered. Dr. Caldwell pocketed the difference. We're reviewing the pharmaceutical accounting right now. Preliminary estimate is $2.3 million. The IT director stepped forward, Marine Corps vet named Clayton, someone who understood chains of command and evidence preservation. He pulled security footage onto the projector screen. Caldwell in the pharmacy at 0300 hours, swapping medication bottles with hands that moved like he'd done this 1,000 times. Caldwell in his office, deleting files from his computer with the kind of methodical precision that screamed experience. Caldwell on the phone, his voice captured through a wall microphone, make sure the inventory matches the billing, not the actual product. Agent Morris flipped through his notes like he was reading an obituary. We're reviewing every patient under Dr. Caldwell's care for the past 36 months. Preliminary analysis suggests at least 200 patients received compromised medications. One of the board members stood up. His face was the color of rage and grief. My father was a patient here last year. He died from complications. Acute renal failure, they said. They said it was sepsis. Agent Morris met his eyes. We'll be investigating every unexpected adverse event. Clayton kept talking. His voice was steady as artillery fire. Dr. Caldwell systematically reassigned veteran nursing staff who might have noticed the discrepancies. 17 experienced nurses transferred over 6 months. Replaced with new graduates. Fresh out of nursing school. No institutional knowledge. No relationships. No ability to question protocol. He pulled up staffing schedules. 7 reassignments visible in 1 month. 8 in another. A pattern as clear as a sniper's shooting trace. Major Torres arrived through a temp agency 3 weeks ago. No institutional history. No connections to staff. She should have been invisible to him. Beneath his notice, Clayton pulled up the medication orders. She identified the inconsistencies in 72 hours. O2 sat climbing in patients who should have been declining. Blood counts that didn't match the medications prescribed. She questioned the protocol. Dr. Caldwell isolated her within 4 hours. More footage, Caldwell making phone calls. Altering the master schedule. Briefing the 20 on-call physicians, exactly 20, the number hanging in the air like an accusation. The 20 who'd refused to respond to the residents' pages. The 20 who'd been told not to acknowledge anything the temp nurse reported. The 20 who'd been ready to let Captain James Hendrick die to protect a pharmaceutical kickback scheme worth $2.3 million. She spotted the drug discrepancies that caused Captain Hendrick's tension pneumothorax, Clayton said. Dr. Caldwell initiated the substandard anticoagulant protocol 6 months ago. The medication interactions created the complication. Major Torres noticed it. That's why Dr. Caldwell had to remove her. Caldwell finally found his voice. It came out the color of crumbling concrete. I need to call my lawyer. Agent Morris nodded. His expression didn't change. You're going to need several. The board chair terminated Caldwell's hospital privileges effective immediately. Medical license suspension proceedings began within the hour. The board voted unanimously to launch a full investigation into his conduct and to contact the State Medical Board, the DEA, and the Joint Commission. Caldwell sat in frozen silence, already calculating the distance to his car, the cost of representation, the number of years that might be waiting for him in a federal facility. The administrator asked the question everyone was thinking, where is Major Torres now? Nobody had an answer. 6 months later, Rachel Torres walked through Seattle General wearing scrubs with Director of Emergency Services embroidered on the pocket. Her office overlooked the trauma bay. The dying succulent from her cardboard box was thriving now on the windowsill. Someone had taught her the right way to water it, the way you treat something fragile that might survive if you show it patience. Marcus was in the hallway, volunteering in patient transport between his college classes, wearing the unit patch his mother had finally explained to him, the one that meant 16 women and 6 men who'd bled out on her floor at FOB Shank and refused to give up because she wouldn't give up. Outside a strip mall across town, Dr. Caldwell sat at a folding table with a banner that read, "Supplemental Insurance, Ask Me How." His face had acquired the kind of permanent expression that comes from understanding exactly how far you've fallen. A middle-aged woman walked past, recognized him, and kept walking. In room 304 at Seattle General, Captain James Hendrick was finally conscious after months of recovery and complications. The substandard anticoagulants had caused internal bleeding that led to his crash, the one that had nearly killed him, the one that Rachel had saved him from while he was unconscious and defenseless. He'd asked to see her 4 times. She'd refused 3. This time she came. He was holding a yellowed letter, 15 years old, folded and refolded so many times the creases looked like scars. "I need you to read this," he said. His voice was weak but steady. She took the letter. Her hands didn't shake. They never did anymore. She opened it and began to read. The words were his handwriting, dated 3 weeks after her court-martial, addressed to Navy Personnel Command. "I am writing to request immediate review and overturn of the court-martial of Major Rachel Torres. The incident in question resulted from my direct order under combat conditions. Major Torres acted appropriately given the intelligence available. The fault lies with command, not with the medical officer who followed lawful orders. I request her full reinstatement and formal commendation for actions that saved lives that day." "This was never filed," she said. "It was filed," Hendrick answered. "It was buried. I found out 2 years later. Someone in the chain of command wanted a scapegoat for Marjah. You were convenient. I tried to fight it. I failed." She folded the letter carefully and set it on the bedside table. One measured breath. One tear escaped. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. "You were my patient. That's all that mattered." She adjusted his for professional, careful, the way a major adjusts care for her people. "What I said to Caldwell in that parking lot, about you deserving better. That was never about judgment. That was about protocol. About what's right." He watched her work. "You still believed in me. After everything." "I believe in my patients," she said. "That's not negotiable." She finished the adjustment and turned to leave. He saw it then, the slight limp, the scar on her forearm, the unit patch Marcus had left on her office door, the quiet dignity of someone who'd already survived the worst and decided to keep showing up anyway. That's what makes a major. Not the rank. Not the medals in a wooden case. The decision to keep showing up when the world's already told you to stop. Through the window, Marcus waved from the hallway, holding coffee. She waved back. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The succulent bloomed. And somewhere in the hospital, another patient was being admitted through the trauma bay, another person who didn't know that the director of emergency services who'd be overseeing their care had held 247 lives together with her bare hands, and the kind of composure that only comes from having already survived the impossible. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment. Tell us, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were completely wrong? We read every single comment and we'd love to hear your story. Thank you for watching.